Yeah, okay, so yeah, thank you. I'm going to talk about this topic, deprivation and hope in child development. And I'm going to talk about some research that I've done in some different countries, but mainly in Ecuador in South America. Both myself and Paulina used to work in Ecuador, which is a small country in South America. And I did some work with street children, for example. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of kind of extreme deprivation levels and how it sort of relates to child development. And I'm currently based at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. But I'm also sort of related to Nazarbayev University. I have sort of worked at Nazarbayev occasionally. You'll recognize that, most of you anyway. That's Nazarbayev University. And that's the psychology section in the university library at Nazarbayev University. So I'm kind of related to the psychology at Nazarbayev already, although there isn't that much of it. And actually, this is my third presentation, I think, for the psychology club. I've done things with the psychology club before, or possibly before your time. Anyway, what I'm going to talk about today is sort of psychosocial deprivation. And we know from lots of research that deprivation, sort of being raised away from parents, for example, or being raised away from care and love, has sort of very serious effects on development. There was some quite nasty research performed with monkeys, with baby monkeys were separated from their mothers and raised with these sort of weird, sort of robotic looking parents. And it severely affected the development of the children, of the babies, the baby monkeys. So it's quite well known how severe it is. And you know, we know this as well from children, for example, raised in orphanages in the sort of some of the former Soviet states like Romania, who had quite severe deprivation. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about work I've done in Sheffield, in England. I'm actually from England, and I did some work with homeless people. I worked with this homeless assessment and support team in England. And I'm just going to quickly go over what we mean by homeless. So homelessness covers a wide range of states. It's not just people rough sleeping. It could be people living in homeless hostels, squatting in vacant buildings, living in tents, which happens in some countries, or a very overcrowded accommodation. And it's not just sort of a British or Western issue. This is a photograph of a homeless man from Kazakhstan. So there's obviously, you know, there are homeless people in Astana, there are homeless people in other cities around Kazakhstan too. So homelessness is quite related to adult deprivation, but I'll tell you, you'll see why I'm going down this route. Now, I did some of this research in other countries. I've done this research in Japan, so cognitive ability of homeless men in Japan as well. And I did some research in Ecuador, similar studies with homeless adults in the city of Quito. These are sort of my assistants in Quito. I'm going to talk about the research I did in England. So this is one of the homeless guys, and this is one of the centres we worked at. We looked at about 80 homeless people, and there was quite a high drug use issue. Between about 40% reported daily use of crack or heroin, and there's high levels of psychiatric contacts. 73% had seen a psychiatrist or been admitted to a psychiatric hospital at some point. And the average IQ was below normal, about 15 points below normal. And I'm not just saying that to sort of stigmatize people. I'm going to sort of raise why that's an important issue to talk about. So 15 points below is quite a large amount to be below sort of the normal point. Now, in populations, about 50% of IQ is linked to genetics, but the other 50% is due to experience. So basically, we're a sort of a mixture of our genetic background and our experiences and our learning, and that's what determines our IQ scores. And this is relevant to why people who've experienced deprivation might score badly on these kind of tests. So at the population level, there's a big difference, but if you actually increase the environmental level if you give people good education, if you give people lots of opportunities, actually the environmental level is able to increase, and then the genetic aspect isn't actually becomes less important. So although it's a sort of 50-50 mix statistically between genetics and environment, we don't need to worry about that because we can actually improve the environment and improve people's intelligence, improve their general cognitive ability. So what might homeless people have experienced that harm their intelligence development? There's one thing I want to talk about particularly, and this is, can you still see my screen? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Because I've got the Zoom bar sort of getting in the way for me. Okay, so if we look at homeless people, this is from my data in England, but those who've experienced or reported very severe to extreme levels of abuse when children, so about 26% reported emotional abuse, about 19% reported severe to extreme sexual abuse, about 32% emotional neglect, and about 28% physical neglect. So this is really very high levels considering it's a very extreme level of abuse. So this could be one reason why we see some of the problems that homeless people experience. Okay. Child abuse affects brain development, and particularly the frontal lobes. So it could be that there might be some brain development issues associated with homelessness caused by abuse when they were children. Now these are the frontal lobes of the brain. Well, the frontal lobes are particularly associated with circuits for the organization of behavior. And there's sort of three main circuits running through the frontal lobes, from the lateral frontal lobe, the medial and the orbital. And they produce different things when they're damaged. So if you have a problem with the lateral, you get problems with working memory, remembering to do things or planning. With the medial, you get a sort of apathy syndrome of low motivation, low interest, lack of hobbies and social life. And with orbital dysfunction, you get disinhibition. And this is things like swearing, risk-taking, sexually inappropriate behavior, aggression, etc. So this is, these are the syndromes we associate with poor development of the frontal lobes or impairment of the frontal lobes. We can measure these sort of personality aspects just with questionnaires. So there's a questionnaire we use, sometimes called the Frontal Systems Behavior Scale, and it measures these different aspects. It's just about questions you ask the person. So I speak only when spoken to. I'm easily angered or irritated. I have emotional outbursts without good reason. And so you can measure this sort of frontal lobe related personality quite easily. Now, the interesting thing, this is my data from England, but what I found was increasing emotional abuse was associated with reduced frontal lobe functioning. Increased sexual abuse was associated with reduced IQ. Increased emotional neglect was associated with lower frontal lobe functioning and with lower IQ. And increased physical neglect was associated with lower frontal lobe functioning and lower IQ. So a lot of the issues we see in current homeless people, if they are having some cognitive problems, a lot of it can be traced back to their experience as children, to the deprivation and abuse they've suffered. Now, that was research I did in England, as I said. In 2010, I went to work in Ecuador in South America, which is a very interesting, very sort of nice country in some ways. it's very varied. It's very, very different to Kazakhstan. We have Pacific coast with lots of beaches. We have the Andes Mountains and the Amazon rainforest, and also the Galapagos Islands with all those animals there. So it's very interesting to tourists. But the social context and the socioeconomic context is less attractive. There's a big gap between rich and poor. This is a sort of typical house that a rich person might live in. Costs $750,000. And that's in Quito, in the capital city. But the majority, most people in Ecuador live in houses like this, or most people in the cities live in houses rather like this. And their experience is quite different. So deprivation compared to sort of developed country standards is quite high. Okay. Now, in particular, this affects children. And these are some photos I took in South America. These are mainly from Ecuador. But children working in the street is actually pretty common in South America. These are children in Quito, in the city, the capital city of Ecuador. You know, so there's a young girl there working, selling things to motorists, and then there's that young boy is a shoe shine. He cleans shoes for people in the city center. And you can see they're both pretty young to be working in the streets. These are, again, a couple of shoe shine boys in the city of Quito in Ecuador. Very young children to be working. This is another boy in Quito in Ecuador. Okay, and he's sort of going through the bars at night, selling bubble gum, things like that. So the sort of midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., he's walking around bars. And so it's dangerous work as well for such young people to be engaged in. Okay, so this is sort of a different example of the socioeconomic deprivation or the psychosocial deprivation. It's kind of different to what I would have seen in England, in a very developed country like that. So we did some research. This is my assistant in Ecuador. We did some cognitive tests with these street children, these children who are sort of associated with working in the street or the homeless in the streets. And we did some cognitive tests to test their ability to sort of reasoning and problem solving. But we also measured, I'd just like to say that they're a very sort of diverse country, Ecuador. There's lots of different cultural backgrounds, but the main 4 groups, we have children called mestizo, well, people called mestizos, which are sort of a mix of European immigrants and the Native Americans. We have Afro-Ecuadorians, of course, people who originated from the slave trade mainly. We have indigenous Americans, and we also have Montubia, which is another ethnic group as well. So these are sort of the children you see around Ecuador. Now, again, we looked at some of the children who are working in the streets and street children. There's some more street children here. Again, this is a boy in Quito, and he's working as a shoe shine. And you can see he's really young to be working. I mean, I don't know how old he is, maybe 6 or 7 years old. And it's culturally, it's kind of normal for people to employ, to pay children a little bit of money to clean their shoes for them. But from my perspective, it seems kind of exploitive, but it's normal in South America. It probably happens in some countries around Central Asia as well, I think. This was a boy I took a photo of in Quito as well. And this was on the front of the Psychologist magazine a few years ago. Again, he's selling candies to motorists. And there's another boy cleaning shoes. If you notice, this boy is from Bolivia, another country in South America. And in Bolivia, the children wear a balaclava mask, so their face is covered up. And that's not because it's cold. They wear that because they're ashamed of their work. So they're working to try and make money cleaning the shoes of middle-class people. But they have to cover their faces because of the shame of doing that. So this is not a very good position for children to be in. We could expect it to be quite a dangerous work, and they could be very, very susceptible to being exploited. And again, this is another photo I took. This is in Paraguay. This is a girl working in the streets, and she's sort of selling things to cars when they stop. They stop at the traffic lights, and she sells things. Again, she's not wearing any shoes, so obviously we can see sort of she comes from a very poor background. Now, with students, we started assisting at a Center for Street Children in Quito. And for research, we asked about traumatic experiences, and we also tested the cognitive ability of some of these children. And what we found was really, quite shocking, I think. We asked each street child to describe something that made them very frightened. And this is one quote that it was in Spanish, but it's translated into English. My cousin was found tortured and shot 5 times in a ditch. And that was a 14-year-old boy who said that. Some men were fighting, and one had a gun. He looked like a cop. He handcuffed the other, took him to an alley, kicked him and shot him. And the person died. And that was an 11-year-old girl who said that. So these children are exposed to some quite extreme violence. And in fact, when we checked them psychologically, we found about 60% of the children had post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a really high level. Children in street gangs have lower levels of PTSD than that. Okay. Now, we also looked at the cognitive test performance, and we found it to be quite a lot worse than what we would find from children. Compared to regular street attending children, school attending children. And so they have poor cognitive development and the sort of highly traumatized group. Now, we said already in populations about 50% of IQ score is linked to genetics, but the other 50% is due to experience. People get sort of confused by this and think that there's nothing you can do about your intelligence. There's nothing you can do about your cognitive ability. The fact that 50% is environment is great news for us as psychologists and as people, because we can, if we work hard and we try to educate people and try and help them, then we increase the environmental contribution, and then we can override and go past that genetic level. So we can actually make a big difference to people, even though there is a genetic component. Now, okay, so I'm just getting to the end now. We can also look at the positive side of this a little bit. Okay, so deprivation is not always associated with a cost. Cross-cultural differences may actually benefit cognition in some cases. Okay, so street children selling candies in the streets of Brazil develop better mathematics skills than school-attending children. Okay, so there's research showing that. There's also research suggesting children working in carpet factories in Nepal develop working memory skills better than school-attending children. So something about the work experience might actually help cognitive development. Here's some other studies here. Homeless Bolivian children perform better than non-homeless children on this creativity test. So this, you see the picture of the key. You ask people to give alternative uses for the key. And you find that homeless children are actually better than that, than not homeless children, perhaps because they have to be resourceful, they have to be creative. And so their experiences have actually helped their development. Again, in this middle pane, if we look, poor South African children perform better than middle-class Australian children on this test. This is a high-level cognitive test. And it may be because the culture in South Africa it's more structured and there's more responsibility for children. So even though they live in poverty, the cognitive development is better. Even neglected children sometimes perform better than non-abused children on cognitive tests. This task here, the tower test with the blue discs, there's evidence that neglected children actually perform that better. So there are actually, we probably shouldn't be thinking about how these poor children are completely affected by deprivation. Some of it is actually just cross-cultural differences, which we can look at in a positive way. And also intelligence can be improved. People don't actually realize this, but it really can. When children move from lower socioeconomic status families into higher socioeconomic status families through adoption, there is a large increase in their IQ scores, around about 12 to 18 points. Okay, that's a huge increase, and that's just moving from a poor family to a more middle-class family. And in fact, if we want to improve someone's IQ, education is the most powerful method we have. Each year of formal education increases IQ by about 3.4 IQ points. So if you want a high IQ, really the way to do it is just to stay in education. Or if you want to help the cognitive development of children, the way to do it is to provide them with good education or provide them with free education. Okay, and some positive things to finish off as well. I talked about homeless people having experienced terrible things and it's affected their development. People can always come out of this. They can always grow. Okay, so this was a news article from a year or two ago about a homeless drug addict who became a professor. This was in Canada. So he's made a remarkable recovery from the terrible state he was in. But my favorite one is this Mario Capecchi. And he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2007 for physiology and medicine. And he was a street child from ages 4 to 9. And this is a great little quote here. I'll read it out to you. So aged 4.5, I started to live on the streets of Bolzano and just kept migrating south. Nobody was able to give me any food, so you had to steal. The people got to know you and made things very unpleasant, and you had to move on. I went in a straight line south through Verona down to Reggio Emilia, where my mother eventually found me. Okay, so this 4.5 years old, and he was living on the streets, and he's managed to sort of go on to such achievements that he received a Nobel Prize. Okay, so there is, there's things to think about with deprivation, but also there's always hope as well. Okay. I'd just like to thank my research assistants. These are sort of people who've done work for me over several different countries, within Ecuador and Japan. And where else? Ecuador and Japan mainly. And also, sorry, that's the end of my presentation. If anyone wants to follow me on social media, there's some things there. Okay, so we have any questions?
Is it some relation between the IQ and it's maybe a little bit off top, but is it some relation with the aging and the IQ decreasing with it?
Yeah, okay. Your cognitive ability, IQ is basically just your general cognitive ability. And a lot of that does decline quite rapidly with age. It goes up as you develop. So 14-year-olds are much smarter than 8-year-olds. But by the time you get to about 24, it's already coming down again, probably even earlier than that. So you guys, you're probably actually at your peak of cognitive performance at the moment. It's all downhill from here. But that it just carries on going down and down as you get older and older. But that's only actually for sort of fluid problems. So reasoning, visual spatial reasoning and thinking and planning and things like that. your actual knowledge of the world stays completely stable. In fact, might go up slightly. So information you learn about the world, general facts you learn, languages you learn, becomes really solid, stable in your mind. And even 80 or 90-year-olds have had no decline in that. Perhaps it's even gone up. Yeah, so intelligence changes over time, depending on how you look at it.
Okay, makes sense.
You can ask me any questions you like about psychology. It doesn't have to be about the presentation if you like. I hope that wasn't too intimidating for you. I know you're sort of not studying psychology, most of you. So I tried to make it quite a visual presentation for you and bring in lots of different things. But obviously, I'm talking about sort of real research and things like that. Some of it might be a little bit boring, or it might be a little bit complicated for you. But we can talk about anything you like, anything to do with psychology while we're here.
Is it the chance that maybe biology students could join the team of the like psychological research, or like have a master's on psychology?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of master's degrees in psychology around the world will accept people without psychology degrees. And in some places they have a special sort of transfer, one where they start at the beginning for you. You can just do a master's in psychology to sort of convert into being a psychologist. Yeah, I know people in the UK who sort of run master's degrees like that. But yeah, I mean, it's good actually to not think about discipline borders too much, because a biologist might actually be doing research which you could call psychology, and some psychologists would do some research which you could call biology. Everything sort of overlaps to some extent.
Okay.
The stuff I do, some things which are quite biological, and I do some stuff it's very medical. Sometimes my research gets published in medical journals, and sometimes it's published in computer science journals. So it depends on the emphasis, but there's no such thing really as a biologist or a psychologist. There's just people doing certain things. And it's a matter of emphasis and a matter of focus. Are you a biologist?
Yes, I'm the biologist, and I want to study psychology actually, but
yeah, there's not many options in Astana at the moment.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I'm about to start my journey on psychology also, and in the future maybe I would get another bachelor on psychology.
Yeah, I mean, you could do it that way if you have to. But I mean, if you're interested in psychological topics, your biological knowledge will come in useful. There are fields of psychology which are just really based on evolution, for example, and interpreting behavior, and they're completely halfway in between biology and psychology. Of course, neuroscience could be it's biology sometimes and it's psychology sometimes. So you can actually you can do psychology from a biological perspective.